This is one of those chapters where we solve one big lingering problem and then immediately run headfirst right into another. With the biggest problem we've been dealing with for the past few chapters, the kids sleepwalking straight towards the fire caused by Loki, finally being dealt with. Though it wasn't easy, almost every attempt to stop them ended in failure due to Somers and his devil fruit. And then when Saul finally did find a way that would work, that's when one of the nightmares conveniently decided to show up and distract him long enough that by the time he beat it, the kids were so close to the fire that he couldn't possibly reach them in time. In the fire, putting that out was a headache in itself, because after getting smacked out of the sky by one of the nightmares, by the time the fire squad finally made it to the fire, even with their hoses at max, they couldn't put it out fast enough to keep the kids from walking right into it. So we actually got to a point in this chapter where Saul, Robin, and Chopper were too far away from the kids to stop them. The fire squad, try as they might, couldn't put out the fire in time, and the kids were literally inches away from stepping into the flames and being burned alive. And I'm going to be honest, for a split second, I thought Oda might actually go through with it. If for no other reason than just to prove how evil and heartless the God Knights actually are. Who, speaking of, do not seem to be bothered at all by the idea that these kids might actually die. In fact, Saint Somers seems to be getting more and more excited the closer the kids get to the fire, almost like he's completely forgotten that their job here is to kidnap them, and instead is simply hoping to cause as much chaos, destruction, and death as he can before he leaves the island. All which are tendencies that I'd expect from a celestial dragon, but Gunko, she's not a world noble, and yet she really isn't much better than him. Sure, she isn't seemingly taking the same kind of weird, heartless pleasure that Somers is in watching these kids walk to their deaths, but she's also not putting in any effort to try and stop them. Almost as if she's completely indifferent to whether or not they survive. Which, after this chapter, is kind of making me question how much stock we should really be putting into the idea that she might actually be a spy for the Revs, because this entire situation is all on her. She's the one that chose the path the kids took, and at any point she could choose to have them go around the flames. Might take a bit longer and gives more time for the Giants to find a way to save them, but at least you don't end up defrying the kids you're supposed to be kidnapping. I can't believe we're in a situation where we'd all actually prefer the kids being kidnapped, but it's a much better choice than them dying by fire, and that's a choice Gunko could make right now, but her choosing not to speaks volumes on whose side she's ultimately on. Now, the only one we don't get a chance to see a reaction from in this chapter is Saint Killingham, and I was really hoping we would, because so far he seems like the most normal out of the three. Unlike most world nobles, he seems to be actually kind of a decent person. We saw him in the previous chapter defending Gunko's hobbies from Somers, something almost no other celestial dragon would dare to do. Mostly because they tend not to see anyone who's also not a celestial dragon as basically not even being human. And he was the only one to show even a little bit of concern about the path the kids were on, leading them directly to the fire and the possibility of them dying because of it. And that being said though, he also hasn't done anything to actually stop said kids from continuing on that path, which you could argue makes him seem just as heartless as the other two. But I would throw in a counter argument that his power is simply controlling whether or not the kids are awake, so there's not much he can do to stop them, aside from forcing Gunko to stop them, which would then force her and Somers to stop him, and the odds of him beating them in a 2v1 probably aren't high, so again, not really much he can do in this situation. Also, him keeping them asleep could also sort of be seen as a kindness. Instead of letting their final moments be filled with fear as they walk towards the fire, with each second stretching out to feel like an eternity, he's instead letting them somewhat die peacefully while stuck in a dream. Again, still not a great choice, but probably the only one he could make in this situation. And had this been a seinen manga or written by Tagashi, the creator of Hunter x Hunter, we might have actually seen it happen, or possibly something even worse. But thankfully, this is Oda. He tends not to be anywhere near that severe when it comes to his writing, and there was almost no way that he would actually do something as drastic as killing off children on screen. So instead, he has Jinbei step in at the very last second to gather all the water from the sea cloud the fire squad is using to put out the flames. And he does it so fast that none of the giants even see him do it or even know that he's there. In fact, the only giant that actually saw what Jinbei did was Colin, since the Straw Hats are traveling with him, and he begins to somewhat fanboy over the fishermen just like he did with both Shanks and Luffy. But the excitement doesn't last long as Gunko decides to make a surprise appearance near the boat after realizing there's still one more kid left for them to capture, causing Colin to do one of the classic eye-popping shocked faces once he realizes that she's there. And not much of a reaction from the rest of the Straw Hats though, well, aside from Usopp, who seems to be just as surprised to see her as Colin is. Thought they'd be a bit more excited about one of the intruders they were after basically falling right into their laps, but it was the end of the chapter, and we already got Colin's reaction and Usopp's in that small panel, so maybe Oda is saving the Straw Hats for the next one. But this was an exciting cliffhanger to leave things on. We finally have the Straw Hats meeting the first of the God Knights, meaning we are now that much closer to my dream matchup of Usopp against Gonko. I don't think it's going to happen in the very next chapter. Half the crew is right there, so there's no chance they're going to end up in a 1v1 right away. Plus, Robin and Chopper are close by, so that's 2 more Straw Hats to add to the mix. My ideal situation is that we get the other 2 God Knights involved very quickly, they scatter the crew between the 3 of them, and we end up with Nami and Usopp as the ones who take on Gonko. I don't really have a preference when it comes to who takes on who for the rest of the players in this conflict, though I guess it would be fun to see Jinbei and Brook team up just because you don't normally see them together that much, and I guess I put them up against Killingham since I have a feeling that he's likely the strongest out of the 3, though I am basing that solely off the fact that he has a Zoan Devil Fruit. Which I guess leaves Chopper and Robin to deal with Sommers, which is kind of fitting since his ability is what kept them from being able to save the kids in the first place, so this will be their chance to strike back at him for everything he's done so far. Again, I don't really have a preference for who fights who, just as long as one of the fights is Usopp against Gunko. Though I will be equally as excited if we get any of the God Knights up against Copper Gaban, because I'd really like to see him in a serious fight before we leave Elbaf. Not that I honestly think any of the God Knights we've met besides Shamrock really pose a threat to him, even at this point in his life, but it's not often that we get to see a legendary pirate in action, so I'm taking any chance I can get. And based on this chapter, it does seem like he's gearing up to fight someone or something. In the translation I read, he mentions hearing a small voice on top of sensing the God Knights, which I think a lot of people are going to take as confirmation that he might also have the voice of all things. And the only pushback I give to that is that so far Luffy hasn't shown any sign of hearing anything, so that might not be what's going on here. But one thing we can say for sure, there's something else on the island besides the God Knights and Loki that might actually pose a threat. And look, I have no proof of this, nothing has even hinted slightly to this being the case, but I think whatever that mysterious third threat is, it has something to do with the person Loki was talking to before meeting the God Knights. Just throwing it out there because I think we've all conveniently forgotten about said person and the fact that we still have no idea who or what that was, and I for one am still waiting for Oda to answer that question. Speaking of answers, in the most shocking twist of the entire chapter, turns out Loki has actually been telling the truth this entire time. For some strange reason, Shanks actually did go to see him while he was on Elbaf and told him exactly where he was going next, which makes me think there's a bit more to their relationship than we initially thought. I was recently rewatching a clip of the anime, and during the scene where Shanks is getting ready to deal with Kid, he does mention being happy that he got to see an old friend on Elbaf that he thought was dead, which I don't think we ever found out exactly who that was. And now I'm enjoying the idea that said friend was Loki, who Shanks seemingly doesn't realize actually hates his guts. It kind of reminds me of the dynamic between Luffy and Law. Sure, Law doesn't outright hate Luffy, but Luffy definitely thinks they're on better terms than Law does. Now, even though Loki does know where Shanks went, he still won't tell Luffy because Luffy still hasn't fully freed him. Sure, he's free from being bound to the Atom Tree, but he still has some of the chains on him, so he's holding out until Luffy unlocks them too. But I think the longer he's around the Yonko, the quicker he'll just give in to tell him, if for no other reason than to get Luffy as far away as possible. Because most of their interactions in this chapter is Luffy trying his best to help the Inter Giant, only to end up hurting him even more by shoving hot food in his face or spilling hot soup on him. And I found it extremely funny that despite being a doctor, Gerd is perfectly okay with Luffy continuing on and causing Loki more pain, just as long as he doesn't actually end up dying. I also found it funny that despite how long he's been with this group so far, Sanji still has no idea exactly what's going on. You would think by now that someone would have filled him in. Honestly though, I didn't think we'd be checking back in with this group until we were well into the fights between the other half of the crew against the God Knights, but even though I was wrong about that, I was right about us completely skipping over Loki's explanation about what really happened to King Harold. Something we know they talked about off screen because Haruden is silent the entire chapter, likely contemplating if he actually believes his brother or not. So because we ended up skipping Loki's retelling of the story, we probably won't be seeing what happened until Jarul is ready to tell it himself. That way we can finally put to bed who between the two is or isn't a traitor. Oh, and on a side note, we end up finding out that Goldberg's shield is in fact a homie, which I mean was kind of obvious once you look at it, but the big question is, whose homie is it? He said the shield used to belong to his dad, so that would suggest that it was created by Mother Caramel, but it also knows Zeus, which doesn't really make much sense because I'm pretty sure Zeus wasn't created until after Big Mom was kicked off of Elbaf, which means that the only way the two of them could have met is if she came back to the Island of Giants during her pirating days. Which before this chapter I would have said wasn't likely due to, you know, the Giants' hatred for Linlin, but now we might have proof that she was back on the island during that time due to a flashback revealing that at one point in the past, the Rocks Pirates had visited the Island of Giants. Or at least Xebec and Whitebeard were, the latter complaining to his captain about his use of excessive force on such a small kid. The kid in question being a very young Loki, who, just like Colin and Luffy idolized Shanks, he seemingly felt the exact same way about rocks. Which honestly isn't that surprising given what we've seen from the Giants so far. Definitely feels like someone who resembles a chaos agent like Rocks more than any other pirate from that era. But unlike Shanks, Rocks is a bit more forceful when it comes to turning down kids who ask to join his crew. Makes me wonder though, had Loki won that fight or at the very least held his own, would Rocks actually have let him join? Kinda makes you wonder, right, how things would have turned out if he actually had. We'd probably be looking at a timeline where at least at one point, Loki was also an Emperor of the Sea. Anyway, as of this very brief flashback, we don't know if any other members of the Rocks Pirates were with them while they're on the island, or if they even had a crew to begin with at this time. For all we know, it could have been at this point just the two of them. We also don't know why they were on the Island of Giants to begin with, but there is a big chance that something on the island tied directly into Rocks' goal of becoming king of the world. Personally, my bet's on the mural, but it could have easily been King Carol's Devil Fruit, or even a third mystery item that we've yet to be introduced to. All we can say for sure is that this wasn't just a vacation. They had a goal for being here, one that likely we won't discover until much later in this arc, or possibly one of the arcs in the future of the series. And until we get that answer, I guess we won't know for sure between Big Mom and Mother Caramel who it was that created Nashi.